The day Carl Weber was captured in the Tunisian desert, he was carrying 47 leaflets in his pack. He had written every word of them himself. The title was printed in thick black ink across the top of each page. Warum Amerika verlieren wird, Why America Will Lose. He had written those leaflets with the conviction of an intellectual, with the calm certainty of a schoolteacher, and with the quiet pride of a man who believed that language could shape the outcome of a war. 2 years later, sitting inside a prisoner of war camp in Fort Bliss, Texas, watching an American soldier set a plate of beef stew and warm bread on the table in front of him, Carl Weber would understand that not one sentence in those 47 leaflets had prepared him for this moment. And this moment would break something in him. Not in the way he had always feared being broken, in a way he never saw coming. To understand how a plate of food could do what 3 years of war could not, you have to understand what Carl Weber and hundreds of thousands of German soldiers had been told about their enemy. Not just told, they believed it. From the early years of the 1940s, the propaganda machine of the Third Reich had built an image of America as a nation of the soft and the spoiled. Radio broadcasts described American soldiers who could not fight without their chocolate rations and their coffee. Newspapers printed photographs of grinning GIs with cigarettes behind their ears and candy bars in their hands, not to inspire anyone but to mock. The message was consistent and relentless. Americans were too comfortable to understand suffering, too soft to endure hardship, too undisciplined to win a real war. The broadcasts used a particular phrase again and again: soldiers of appetite, men who fought for their stomachs, not their souls. In the frozen bunkers and the sand-covered trenches of North Africa, German soldiers laughed at that image. They joked about the enemy who needed a hot meal to feel brave. They passed around the newspapers and pointed at the photographs of American soldiers eating sandwiches and drinking Coca-Cola out of glass bottles, and said to each other, "Look at what we are fighting. Look at what stands between us and victory." Carl Weber was not just a receiver of this message. He was one of the people who built it at the level of his own unit. Before the war, he had taught German literature at a secondary school in Hamburg. He was tall and lean in the way that readers tend to be lean, carrying more books than muscle, with wire-rimmed glasses he had worn since the age of 15. His wife Lena used to tell him he looked like a teacher, no matter what he put on, even in uniform, and he never argued with her because she was right. He was not a fighter. He had never wanted to be. What made him useful to the war, what made him genuinely dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with a rifle, was his ability to persuade. When Carl Weber wrote that American soldiers could not endure what German soldiers endured, he wrote it in the voice of a scholar. He built arguments. He used evidence. He wrote with the quiet authority of a man who had read more than the men around him, and who organized those facts into sentences that felt like conclusions. That was why soldiers believed him. Not because the words made their blood run hot, but because the words seemed reasonable. He had never once stopped to ask whether they were true. When the unit was surrounded in the valley outside Tunis in May of 1943, and the commanding officer gave the order to put down their weapons, Carl was already thinking about the leaflets. Not about his safety, not about Lena, or about his daughter Marta, who was 4 years old and who he had not seen in 8 months. He was thinking about the 47 printed pages in his pack that had not yet been distributed. He had worked on the final revision the night before. He had been proud of the opening paragraph. He did not destroy them. He did not think to. By afternoon, he was sitting in a long row of prisoners on the hard ground, waiting to be loaded onto American transport trucks. The sun was enormous above the Tunisian plateau. The dust was everywhere in his teeth, in his collar, and behind his glasses. He sat with his pack between his knees and looked at the American soldiers moving along the line, and he felt for the first time in 3 years that he had nothing particular to do. No leaflet to finish, no evening briefing to prepare, just a long row of men, the dust, and the sounds of American engines coming closer. In his pack, he had 47 leaflets and one photograph. The photograph was of Lena standing in front of the apartment building on Osterbrook Strasse, holding Marta, who was squinting into the sun, and laughing at something outside the frame of the picture. Carl did not take it out. He knew exactly where it was. The Americans loaded them onto trucks with a kind of brisk efficiency that Carl noticed even then, even through the dust and the exhaustion and the particular humiliation of having surrendered. There was no cruelty in it. There was no celebration either. Just American soldiers doing a job moving a line of prisoners from one place to another with the same practiced indifference they might use to load cargo. He filed that observation away. He did not know what to do with it yet. The transport ship that carried Carl and nearly 800 other prisoners across the Atlantic was the USS West Point, a luxury ocean liner that had been converted for military use. Below the main deck in the long sleeping quarters that had once held passengers paying for a pleasant crossing, the men were stacked in bunks 3 high and told to stay below unless ordered otherwise. The porthole windows were too small and too high to show much of anything. The ship smelled of fuel and men and the particular chemical cleanness of military disinfectant. On the second night, when the swells outside began to rock the hull, and most of the men were too seasick to sleep, a man named Braun started talking. Braun had been a mechanic before the Army. He had a mechanic's habit of cataloging problems in order from worst to least bad, and his accounting of what awaited German prisoners in America reflected that tendency. The Americans would use them as labor in the coal mines. The food would be barely enough to stay alive. The guards would be brutal, and there would be no recourse, no Red Cross visits, no mail from home. He had heard all of this from a German-American interpreter at the processing center in Tunisia, a man who had seemed genuinely frightened on their behalf. The men in the neighboring bunks listened. Some of them had heard similar stories. A few pushed back, said the Americans had to follow the Geneva Convention, said there were rules. Braun said the rules were only as good as the men enforcing them, and everyone in that dark pitching hold knew that was true. Carl lay on his bunk and listened to all of it and said nothing. He was running an inventory in his mind, not of fears but of evidence. The ship itself was evidence. The fact that it had been a luxury liner was evidence. The conversion to military use had been done with clear engineering competence, the modifications precise, the systems functioning. Everything about the crossing so far had been organized with a thoroughness that his own side had not always managed. He kept turning that observation over like a stone, looking at what was underneath. He had written in the 3rd leaflet of the series that American industry was incapable of the sustained coordination required for modern warfare. That America was too individualistic, too fragmented, too devoted to comfort to build the kind of unified machine a real war demanded. He had been pleased with that section. It had felt logical. It had felt true. The ship groaned and shifted in a large swell. Somewhere 2 bunks over a man was sick. Carl closed his eyes. The night before they reached port, he took one of the leaflets out of his pack. He unfolded it carefully along the old creases and read the first line by the dim light from the quarter. Americans do not know what hunger is. He read it twice. Then he refolded it along the same creases and put it back. Not because he believed it anymore, because he was not yet ready to disbelieve it. He needed to see what came next. What came next was Newport News, Virginia, in the gray light of an August morning in 1943. As the ship moved into the harbor, the prisoners who were allowed on deck pressed against the rails and looked at the shore in silence. There was no poverty visible. There was no chaos. What there was instead were cranes. Enormous steel cranes working steadily along the length of the docks, lifting and lowering cargo containers with a mechanical patience that suggested they had been doing this for a long time and expected to keep doing it long after the men on the ship were gone. Beside the cranes were warehouses, long rows of them reaching back from the waterfront, their steel doors opening and closing as forklifts moved in and out. Beyond the warehouses were more buildings, and beyond those were roads, and on the roads were trucks, dozens of them moving in both directions with the unhurried confidence of a system that knew where everything was supposed to go. A man named Mueller was standing next to Carl at the rail. Mueller was a former teacher as well. Mathematics from a village in Bavaria, with a round face and a habit of stating observations very quietly as if he were checking his own work. He looked at the docks for a long time and then said in German, "More than Hamburg." He said it without inflection, without judgment, as a simple measurement. Carl did not answer. Muller did not seem to expect one. They were put on trains that same morning. The windows were covered with wire mesh, but the mesh was wide enough to see through clearly, and for 2 days and 2 nights, Carl sat with his face close to the glass and watched America go past. It did not match the country he had written about. Not the roads, not the farmland, not the towns. The roads were wide and well-maintained. The farms were enormous, and the machines moving through them. The harvesters and the tractors were large and evidently modern. The towns they passed through were not grand, but they were intact, their houses and storefronts without damage, their streets without rubble. There were lights on at night. In one small town, Carl counted 14 automobiles parked on a single block. He counted them twice to be sure. He thought about Hamburg, about the rationing notices that Lena had written about in her last letter before his capture, about the way she had described standing in line for bread in the cold, and how she did not complain about it, but described it in the even practical tone of someone who had decided that complaining would not help. He did not say anything to the men around him on the train. He looked out the window and thought his thoughts and kept them to himself. Fort Bliss sat at the eastern edge of El Paso, Texas, where the city gave way to desert, and the desert gave way to the Franklin Mountains rising gray and bare in the distance. The camp was not what any of them had imagined from Braun's descriptions. There were guard towers and barbed wire, yes, and men with rifles at the gates, but there were also barracks that were clean and solid, a medical building, a mess hall, and in the afternoon light, the whole compound had a quality of order that was neither threatening nor warm. It was simply functional. It was built to hold men and to keep them alive, and it appeared designed to do exactly that. A young American soldier named Bobby Garner was standing at the main gate when the trucks rolled in. He was 19 years old and from a small town in Iowa, and he was trying his best to look like someone who had been doing this for years. He held his rifle correctly and kept his face neutral and watched the prisoners climb down from the trucks. One of the older prisoners, a man with gray at his temples and a limp from an old wound, looked at Garner directly and said something in German. Garner did not understand it. The tone was not hostile. It sounded almost like recognition. Garner looked away. Carl Weber stepped down from the truck and stood on the Texas dirt for the first time and looked around. The air was dry and hot in a way that was different from the Tunisian desert thinner somehow, with a clarity that made the mountains in the distance look closer than they were. He adjusted his glasses. He picked up his pack. He stood in the line with the others and looked at the mess hall building and noticed even then, even in that first moment of arrival, that something was coming from it. A smell. Faint because the afternoon wind was blowing the wrong way, but there. Something cooking, something real. He filed that observation away too. Sergeant Roy Calloway had been running the Fort Bliss mess kitchen for 4 months when Carl arrived. He was 32 years old and from a farm outside Hutchinson, Kansas, and before the war he had worked as an assistant cook at a diner on the main road where truckers stopped for eggs and coffee and pie at 3 in the morning. He had learned to cook from his mother and from a short-order cook named Delbert, who had taught him that the difference between food that people remember and food that people merely eat is timing. Everything is timing. You pull the bread 1 minute early and it is dough inside. 1 minute late and it is bark. The right moment is the right moment and nothing else will do. The Army had found out about his cooking and his logistics experience at the same time and had made him responsible for feeding the prisoners at Fort Bliss. He had not argued. He had showed up on his first day, looked at what he had to work with, and started cooking. He was not doing it to be kind. He was doing it because it was what he had been ordered to do, and Roy Calloway was a man who followed his orders and did his job with whatever skill he had, and did not make a show of it either way. Eddie had died the previous summer, more than a year into Roy's posting at Fort Bliss, on a day that had looked like every other day until it did not. Eddie Calloway, 24 years old, ambushed in a village in Normandy on the 21st of June in 1944. Roy had received the telegram 21 days later. He had been in the Fort Bliss supply room working through an inventory he had already done twice that week for no reason he could have named, and the telegram had been handed to him by a corporal who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Roy had read it once and folded it and put it in his breast pocket and finished the inventory. Then he had gone back to his quarters and fried a full pan of eggs, more eggs than he could eat, and then stood over the pan, looking at the eggs and not eating them, and then scraped them into the trash and gone to bed. He did not talk about Eddie. He did not put a photograph on his bunk. He went to work every morning and he cooked what he was supposed to cook, and he did it right. And that was the only answer he had to the question of how you keep moving when the reason you were most trying to move for is gone. On the fourth day after Carl Weber arrived at Fort Bliss, a routine pack inspection turned up the 47 leaflets. A young corporal pulled them out of the bottom of Carl's pack and did not know what to make of them, but recognized the official print quality and the deliberate layout and brought them to the sergeant on duty. The sergeant did not read German, neither did anyone else in the immediate chain of command except for one person, which was how the leaflets ended up in the hands of Roy Calloway. Calloway could read German slowly the way a man reads a language he studied briefly in high school and never used again, sounding words out against a memory that had grown thin over the years. He took the leaflets into the back corner of the kitchen after the breakfast shift near the large cast iron range that his mother had sent from the farm in Hutchinson, a range that had cooked for 3 generations of the Calloway family and was now in the particular logic of wartime cooking for German prisoners of war in Texas. He spread one of the leaflets on the prep table and read it line by line with his finger moving slowly beneath each sentence. It took him 15 minutes. The leaflet, the one titled Why America Will Lose, argued that American soldiers were constitutionally incapable of the discipline required for sustained warfare, that the comfort and abundance of American life had produced men who could function when times were easy, but would fracture when faced with genuine suffering, that the German soldier hardened by necessity and motivated by something deeper than convenience would ultimately prevail because he was fighting with his whole self, while the American was only fighting with his appetite. The final paragraph read, "The American soldier fights out of habit, the German soldier fights out of belief, and when these two meet in the dark, habit will break before belief does." Calloway read that paragraph twice. Then he folded the leaflet along its printed creases and placed it in his breast pocket against his chest, where he kept the telegram about Eddie. He did not report it to the duty sergeant. He did not seek out the prisoner who had written it. He did not throw it away. He kept it for reasons he could not have explained clearly, as though it were a piece of evidence in a case that had not yet come to trial. Carl Weber did not know the leaflet had been found. No one told him. For the first weeks at Fort Bliss, he was simply another prisoner in the compound, learning the rhythms of the place, the timing of the meals, and the guard rotations, and the hours when the exercise yard was open. He kept mostly to himself. He had never been a man who sought out company easily, and the forced closeness of the barracks, 20 men sleeping in one long room, was something he had to manage deliberately rather than fall into naturally. He watched things. The American guards did their rounds with no particular hostility and no particular warmth. The administrative staff processed paperwork efficiently. The medical unit treated injuries and illnesses without apparent distinction between urgency and inconvenience. Everything functioned. The machinery of the camp ran with a steadiness that was itself a kind of statement, though Carl was still working out exactly what it was saying. And then came the evening of the fourth day. Dinner at Fort Bliss was served at 6 o'clock in a mess hall that held 300 men at long wooden tables under electric lights. The kitchen opened at 5:30 and the smell moved through the compound before the doors did. Carl was in the exercise yard when it reached him. He stopped walking. He stood still. He had not smelled food like that in a long time. Not one smell, but several layered into each other. Beef stew, the kind made with the meat cooked long enough to soften into the broth and pull apart at the touch of a spoon. Fresh bread, not the dense, dark bread of German field rations, but something lighter with a crisp crust. And underneath those two almost hidden coffee. Real coffee. Not the roasted barley and acorn substitute that had been standard in his unit for the last year and a half. Coffee from actual coffee beans ground and brewed, its smell rising through the Texas evening air with an honesty that had nothing to do with propaganda or morale or any of the uses to which Carl Weber had put language in his professional life. It just smelled like coffee. It just smelled like the thing it was. His stomach contracted, not with hunger exactly, though he was hungry, with something harder to name, with recognition. He joined the line into the mess hall. At the serving counter, a soldier he had not seen before placed a tray in front of him. On the tray was a deep bowl of beef stew with potatoes and carrots, a small round bread roll with a pale crust, a tin mug of coffee, and in the corner of the tray, on a small square of white paper, a brownie. A chocolate brownie, palm-sized, dense, the kind his wife used to make on the Sunday afternoons before the war, when they still had sugar and chocolate, and Sunday afternoons that did not require any particular courage to get through. Carl Weber carried the tray to a seat at one of the long tables and sat down. He did not eat immediately. He looked at the tray for a moment that seemed to last longer than it was. Around him, 200 other men were sitting down, picking up spoons, lifting mugs. The sound of the mess hall was the sound of metal on ceramic and the scrape of benches and very little conversation. Because something about the first meal in a new place makes men quiet, makes them turn inward rather than outward, makes them eat with a concentration that has nothing to do with manners. Carl picked up his spoon. He had eaten the ration biscuits of the North African campaign. He had eaten field soup made from the same base ingredients for so many consecutive days that the smell of it had become neutral, had stopped triggering anything beyond the basic information that it was food and he should consume it. He had eaten toward the end less than he should have because supply lines had been failing and portions had been shrinking, and there were days when the question was not what to eat, but whether there would be enough to maintain the level of function the mission required. The first spoonful of stew was beef that had been cooked slowly in real broth with vegetables that had been added at the right time, so they were soft but not dissolved. The salt was right. The warmth of it moved through him with a physical specificity that he was not prepared for. He kept his eyes down and ate the second spoonful and the third. Halfway through the bowl, he realized that his eyes had gone wet. Not weeping, not the dramatic collapse of a man who had been holding himself together with great effort. Just the quiet physiological response of a body that had been running below capacity for long enough that the sudden availability of what it needed produced an overflow. He blinked once, looked at the table, kept eating. He ate every bite. The stew, the bread which was warm and soft inside the crust, in which he ate slowly, tearing small pieces the way his mother had taught him not to rush through good bread. The coffee which he held in both hands and drank without putting it down until the mug was empty. And finally, the brownie which he set aside and looked at for a moment before eating it in two careful bites. When the tray was empty, he sat with his hands around the empty mug and looked at nothing in particular. The white paper square that the brownie had rested on was still on the tray. It was plain paper, nothing printed on it, nothing written. A piece of kitchen packaging from the Fort Bliss mess hall. He picked it up and folded it along a crease and put it in his breast pocket. He could not have said why. He just did it. Bobby Garner was stationed at the far end of the mess hall near the fire exit because it was his shift. He was watching the room the way a new guard learns to watch a room, with the slightly unfocused attention of someone who has been told to notice everything and has not yet learned which things matter. He watched the German prisoners eat. He watched the way men who had been thin and hard from too long in the field settled almost visibly at the act of sitting down to a meal. He watched faces that had been held careful and neutral in the yard go slack for a moment as the food hit them. He watched one man, the thin one with the glasses, who sat alone near the center of the table, eat with a thoroughness and a privacy that made Bobby feel obscurely that he was witnessing something he had not been meant to see. Bobby was 19 years old and from Iowa, And he had never been hungry in his life. He had never until this moment understood that feeding someone could look like something other than a transaction. He stood at his post and watched and did not say anything, and filed the image away in the part of his memory that a person does not know they are using until much later when they try to explain something to someone who was not there. In the kitchen, Roy Calloway was cleaning the range. He scrubbed the iron surface with a long-handled brush, and the motion was the same motion he had used in the diner in Hutchinson, the same pressure, the same direction. Outside the mess hall window, the Texas sky had gone the deep orange of a desert sunset, and the air was beginning to cool. From the exercise yard, he could hear the sound of men talking, the ordinary sound of a large group of people settling into the end of a day. He thought about Eddie. He almost always thought about Eddie when he was cleaning the range, not in a way that required any particular response. Just thought about him, the way he laughed at things their father said, the way he had been first in line at the recruiter's office and had come home that evening with his papers already signed. Not proud exactly, just certain the way Eddie was always certain about the things he decided. He kept the leaflet in his breast pocket. He had read it enough times by now that he could have reconstructed most of it from memory. He did not know yet why he was keeping it. He only knew that the man who had written it was somewhere in this compound, sitting at one of those long tables eating the food that Roy Calloway had cooked, and that something about that fact required a response that Roy had not yet found the shape of. He finished cleaning the range. He turned off the kitchen lights. He stood for a moment in the dark with one hand on the iron surface, feeling the residual heat of the day's cooking fading slowly into the Texas night. Then he went to his quarters and lay down and did not sleep for a long time. Carl Weber lay on his bunk in Barracks B and looked at the ceiling in the dark. He could hear the breathing of 19 other men. Somewhere outside, a night bird was calling a sound he did not recognize, something native to this desert that he had never encountered before. The smell of the stew was gone now, but the warmth of it was still in him, the particular warmth of having eaten enough of being genuinely full for the first time in longer than he could easily calculate. In his breast pocket was a white paper square that had done nothing but hold a piece of chocolate cake. He had folded it 4 times, and it was smaller than a matchbook now. He pressed his hand against his pocket and felt it there, small and firm, and stared at the ceiling and thought about a country that fed its enemies this well. He had 47 leaflets in his pack that said, this country would lose the war. He had not yet decided what to do with that contradiction. But he knew lying there in the Fort Bliss dark with a full stomach for the first time in years that the answer would have to come. Because something in that mess hall tonight had shifted some understanding he had been carrying without knowing its weight, and now that it had moved, he could feel the space it had left behind. He did not sleep for a long time either. Outside, the desert was very quiet. The mountains were dark shapes against a sky full of stars. Bobby Garner walked the perimeter fence on his midnight patrol, his boots crunching on the dry ground at regular intervals, and he thought about the man with the glass and eating alone at the long table, and about the way a room full of hungry men had gone silent at the moment food was placed in front of them, silent in a way that had nothing to do with suspicion or submission or any of the things he had been trained to watch for. He thought about how that silence had felt like something true. He walked the fence and said nothing to anyone, and the desert night was very quiet around him. But what none of them knew yet, not Carl Weber lying in his bunk, not Roy Calloway lying in his not Bobby Garner walking the wire, was that the leaflet folded in Calloway's breast pocket was about to become the pivot point around which the next several months would turn, that it was not finished doing its work, that the man who had written it and the man who had been carrying it were moving without either of them choosing it toward the moment when they would have to stand in the same room and be honest with each other about what those words had cost. That moment was still weeks away, but it was coming. The night bird called again outside the barracks. The stars moved slowly over Fort Bliss. And somewhere in the dark, a man who had spent 3 years telling soldiers that Americans were too soft to fight was lying awake with the taste of American coffee still on his tongue, wondering what exactly he had been wrong about and how far back the wrongness went. The days that followed at Fort Bliss settled into a rhythm that Carl Weber learned the way a man learns the layout of a house he did not choose to live in. Up at 6, roll call in the exercise yard while the Texas sky was still pale at the edges. Breakfast at 6:30, work details or physical exercise according to the posted schedule. Lunch at noon, an afternoon of relative quiet. Dinner at 6, evening roll call. Sleep. The food never failed to show up. That was the thing Carl could not stop thinking about in those first weeks and then in the weeks that followed. It was not luxury. The mess hall at Fort Bliss was not a restaurant, and it was not trying to be, but it was consistent in a way that had its own kind of weight. Breakfast brought eggs or oatmeal or both with bread and butter and coffee that was hot when it reached the tables. Lunch was thick soup with beans or lentils, sometimes with ground meat mixed in, always with bread. Dinner was a hot main course, most often beef or pork stew with potatoes and whatever vegetables the supply chain had delivered that week. On Sundays, there was roasted chicken or pork, and every few weeks, a dessert appeared, a POW or peach cobbler or canned fruit with cream, and the men around the tables would receive these additions in silence, the way people receive things they have stopped expecting. Nobody in the compound said openly what all of them understood. They were eating better here than they had been eating at the front in the last year of the North Africa campaign. Not a little better, significantly better. The rations toward the end in Tunisia had been a study in subtraction each week, slightly less than the week before the meals growing thinner, while the fighting did not. Here the portions were the same on Tuesday as they had been the Tuesday before and the Tuesday before that. The system did not fluctuate. It did not reward or punish. It simply fed. Roy Calloway ran the kitchen the way he ran everything, which was to say, without ceremony and without complaint, and with a precision that came not from perfectionism, but from understanding what happened when the timing was wrong. He had learned early that food prepared carelessly communicated something to the person receiving. It's some quiet message about how much their appetite mattered to the person doing the cooking, and he had decided a long time ago that he was not willing to send that message to anyone he fed, regardless of the circumstances. So the meat was cooked at the right temperature for the right amount of time. The bread came out of the oven when it was ready and not before. The coffee was brewed in batches small enough to stay hot, and when one batch ran low, a new one was already brewing. He did not think of it as generosity. He thought of it as doing the job correctly. Carl Weber noticed the difference between those two things without being able to name it precisely. He noticed it in the way a person who has spent years studying language notices the gap between what is said and what is meant. Calloway was not being kind. He was being accurate. And that accuracy applied every single day to the feeding of men who had been designated as enemies, said something that Carl could not locate anywhere in his 47 leaflets. It said something about the nature of strength that did not fit the argument he had built so carefully in those pages. He turned it over in his mind during the long, quiet afternoons. He did not arrive at a conclusion quickly. The letter from Lena came 6 weeks after Carl reached Fort Bliss. It had been routed through the International Red Cross, and it had taken 3 months in transit, the paper thin from handling the envelope soft at the corners, from having been opened and resealed at the censorship office. Lena's handwriting was very small, the way it always was when she was trying to fit a great deal onto a limited surface, and Carl read it slowly in the barracks on a Tuesday afternoon while the men around him played cards or slept or stared at the ceiling. She wrote about the apartment on Osterbrookstrasse. The winter had been hard. Ration books had been revised again in November, the meat allocation cut to almost nothing available, only on certain designated days, and then only in quantities that did not go far between 3 people. Butter was measured out in grams at the distribution point carefully by a woman who Lena described without judgment as doing the best she could with what she had. Coffee had been gone for so long that Lena no longer mentioned the absence, except to note in passing that Marta had recently asked what coffee smelled like, having heard the word and not knowing the thing. They were drinking something made from roasted barley and chicory root that was the right color, but not, Lena wrote with the small, dry humor Carl had always loved in her, the right anything else. Marta was growing. She was thin, but she was growing. Lena ended the letter the way she ended most letters, with the particular careful optimism of a woman who understood that the person reading her words was far away and could not do anything immediately useful with worry. She said she hoped Carl was keeping well. She said she hoped the Americans were treating him decently. She said she hoped they were giving him enough to eat. Carl read that last sentence and set the letter down on his knee and looked out the barracks window. Outside, the afternoon wind was moving through the compound from the direction of the kitchen building, and it carried with it the smell of tonight's dinner already beginning. Real coffee in the first stage of brewing, something with onions and fat in the pan, bread not yet in the oven but coming. He sat with the letter on his knee and the smell of food in the air and did not move for a long time. That evening at dinner, he sat in his usual spot, and the soldier at the serving counter placed the tray in front of him, and he looked at what was on it. Roast pork with gravy, mashed potatoes with butter worked into them, a dinner roll, coffee, a small square of yellow cake on a paper napkin. He ate all of it. He always ate all of it. But that evening, he ate it differently than he had before, slowly, with a kind of deliberate attention, as if he were trying to understand each item, not just as food, but as a fact about something larger than itself. His daughter had asked what coffee smelled like. His wife was measuring butter in grams. And here was butter pressed into mashed potatoes in quantities that nobody at this table had thought to question. He carried that weight back to the barracks and lay with it in the dark. What he did not know yet, what was sitting unspoken between himself and a man he had never directly spoken to, was moving toward him through the ordinary days of the camp like a slow tide. He could not see it, but it was coming. Major Daniel Reeves arrived at Fort Bliss on the 8th of February, 1945. He came from a military hospital in Maryland, where he had spent 6 weeks being evaluated for what the paperwork called adjustment difficulties following a family bereavement. The bereavement was the death of his son James, 22 years old, Corporal James Reeves of the 82nd Airborne, killed in action in the Ardennes Forest in Belgium on the 22nd of December, 1944. 3 days before Christmas. Reeves was 47 years old, and before the war, he had been a corporate attorney in Philadelphia, a man whose professional life had consisted entirely of the careful reading of documents and the identification of what those documents permitted and what they did not. He had spent 20 years finding the language in contracts that protected his clients and the language that exposed them, and he had become very good at this because he was patient and precise and did not allow emotion to distort his reading of a text. He had not been able to apply these skills to the telegram about James. There was no language in it that permitted anything. There was no clause that could be argued. The telegram was a statement of fact, and it admitted no interpretation, and it left Reeves standing in the hospital corridor in Maryland with a piece of paper in his hand and 20 years of professional training that were entirely useless to him. He asked to be returned to active duty. When they assigned him to Fort Bliss as deputy camp commander, he accepted without comment and arrived on a cold February morning and went directly to his desk and began reading the camp's operational documents. He read the Geneva Convention's provisions regarding prisoner of war treatment in full. He read them twice. Then he read the camp's current food procurement records and compared the per capita caloric provision to the convention's specified minimums. The camp under Sergeant Calloway's management was providing food at a level approximately 25% above the minimum required. This was not illegal. It was not even unusual. Many camps operated at similar levels on the grounds that healthier prisoners were more manageable prisoners. But Reeves read the numbers, and the numbers said something to him. They said that these men were eating well while James was buried in Belgian soil. They said that the enemy was being fed above the required standard while American sons were dying. They said there was a gap here, and Reeves was a man who had spent his career closing gaps. He scheduled a meeting with Calloway the following week. The meeting was short. Reeves laid the procurement records on the table between them and indicated the relevant figures. He explained accurately and without embellishment that the current provision level exceeded the Geneva minimum by a legally significant margin, and that reduction to minimum standard would represent a substantial cost saving while remaining fully within the requirements of international law. Calloway looked at the figures, then he looked at Reeves. He asked if he could ask why. Reeves told him. He did not make a speech of it. He said simply that his son had died at the Battle of the Bulge in December, and that the men currently eating in the Fort Bliss mess hall were eating better than the families they had left behind in Germany. He said it without theatrics, the way a lawyer states a material fact. The silence that followed was a particular kind of silence. Calloway understood it. He understood it in a way that went past sympathy into something closer to recognition, because he also had a dead brother and also had spent time asking himself why some men came home from the war and others did not, and whether the answer had anything to do with fairness. He understood, and then he said he could not agree. Reeves did not push. He wrote a note in the margin of the procurement report and took the folder back under his arm and said good morning and left. He would return to this through the proper channels, through documentation and process, through the language of institutional procedure that was the only language he fully trusted anymore. He was in no hurry. He had nowhere in particular he was trying to get to. Clara Hoffman had been working in the Fort Bliss medical unit since the previous summer. She was 27 years old, the daughter of Bavarian immigrants who had come to America in 1921 and settled in Cincinnati, and she had grown up speaking German at home and English everywhere else, moving between the two languages, the way a person moves between rooms in a house they have lived in so long that they no longer think about which door leads where. She had not advertised her German to the prisoners. There was no regulation against it, and she was not hiding it exactly, but she had found in the first weeks that the men spoke more honestly among themselves when they believed she could not understand them, and the things they said when they believed this were more useful to her work than the things they said when they knew she was listening. She treated injuries and illnesses and noted what she observed and said nothing she did not need to say. She had noticed the leaflet the first time it came out of Calloway's pocket. She had been in the kitchen collecting medical supplies, a weekly task that brought her into contact with Calloway more regularly than most staff, and she had watched him reach into his breast pocket for something and watched the folded paper come out with it and watched him catch it quickly and tuck it back. The movement was practiced. He had done it before. She had said nothing at the time. She had filed it away. 3 weeks into February, she went to the kitchen in the mid-afternoon when the lunch cleanup was done and the dinner preparation had not yet fully started, and she found Calloway alone at the prep table, working through the next week's supply request. She set down the empty supply case and asked without preamble whether he still had the leaflet. He said he did. She asked why. He was quiet for a moment. He wiped his hands on the kitchen towel he kept over his left shoulder and looked at the supply list instead of at her and said that he needed to understand what the man who wrote it was thinking before he decided what to do about it. She asked whether he knew the connection between the leaflet and his brother. He turned and looked at her fully for the first time. He asked how she knew about Eddie. She told him she had read his file when he arrived, as she read all the files. Then she told him what she had pieced together from the intelligence summaries that passed through the medical unit documents that contained details about prisoner backgrounds that most of the camp staff did not read carefully. She told him that Eddie's unit had been ambushed on June 21st in Normandy while pursuing a retreating German column. She told him that the retreating column had been elements of the 21st Panzer Division and that the division had refused to withdraw even when withdrawal was tactically correct, had continued engaging at a point when most experienced officers would have pulled back. She told him that the intelligence assessment attributed this to an unusually high unit morale in the final weeks before the ambush, and that the assessment noted in one subordinate clause in the third paragraph that high-quality propaganda material had been circulated through the division in the preceding month. She told him that the author and the unit were the same. She said she did not know for certain that Karl Weber's leaflet had kept those men fighting past the point where Eddie's unit was safe. She said the connection was probable, not proven. Calloway stood very still. He was not looking at Clara. He was looking at the wall above the stove at nothing in particular with the quality of stillness that belongs to a man who is holding something very heavy and deciding where to put it down. He asked very quietly which barracks. She told him. He was gone from the kitchen in under a minute. It was late afternoon and the light in Barracks B was the flat yellow of a Texas winter afternoon, coming in low through the windows along the south wall. Carl Weber was at his bunk writing a letter to Lena. He had been trying to write this letter for 3 days and had gotten no further than the date and her name because everything he had started to say after her name had turned out on rereading to be something other than the truth, and he had run out of ways to tell himself the difference did not matter. He heard the door. He looked up. Roy Calloway walked the length of the barracks without looking at anyone else. He stopped at Carl's bunk and placed the leaflet on the writing surface in front of him. He said nothing. He stood and waited. Carl looked at the leaflet. He recognized it immediately. His own layout, his own typeface, selections, the particular weight of the paper he had requested for the series because thinner paper tore at the fold lines. He recognized the first line without having to read it. He looked up at Calloway. Calloway spoke in English, each word measured out separately. He said, "You wrote this." It was not a question. Carl did not need to calculate a response. He nodded once. The barracks had gone very quiet. The men at the far end who had been playing cards had stopped. The man on the next bunk who had been reading had lowered his book. Nobody spoke. The kind of silence that gathers when something is about to happen that everyone can feel and nobody can name. Calloway said, "My brother died, June 21st, because the unit he was pursuing did not retreat when they should have retreated." He paused. He looked at the leaflet on the table and tapped it once with 2 fingers. "Because of things like this." Carl said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say. He understood enough English to have followed every word, and he understood the weight behind those words, and he sat with his hands in his lap and looked at Calloway and did not look away. Calloway leaned forward. His hands came down on the writing surface on either side of the leaflet, and he brought his face to within a foot of Carl's, and Carl could see the tendon in Calloway's jaw working and the particular stillness in his eyes that is not calm, but is the thing a person builds over calm to keep it from being visible. The pulse in Calloway's throat was working hard. Carl could see that too. 10 seconds passed, possibly 20. Carl counted them without meaning to. Then Calloway straightened. He picked up the leaflet. He folded it carefully along the existing creases and placed it back in his breast pocket over his heart, where he had been carrying it since the day it was found in Carl's pack. He turned and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped. He did not turn around. He said, "Dinner is at 6, same as always." Then he walked out. Bobby Garner had been standing at the end of the barracks near the fire door, because that was where he had been standing when Calloway walked in, and he had not moved since. He had not breathed for most of the exchange. When Calloway's footsteps faded on the gravel outside, Garner let out a breath so slowly and carefully that it was nearly inaudible. He stared at the barracks door for a moment and then looked at the floor and thought about what it meant to have more reasons to do something wrong than to do something right and to do the right thing anyway. He was 19 years old and from Iowa, and he filed this thought away in the place where he kept all the things he did not yet have language for. Carl Weber sat at his bunk for a long time after Calloway left. The letter to Lena was still in front of him, the date and her name at the top and nothing else below it. He picked up the pen. He sat with it for several minutes. Then he put it down again and lay back on the bunk and looked at the ceiling. He had spent 3 years of his professional life building the argument that Americans were incapable of the discipline required by genuine struggle, that they were creatures of appetite and comfort who would break when tested by something that did not yield a comfort. He had built that argument carefully with evidence and logic and the tools of his education, and soldiers had read it and believed it, and believing it, they had fought longer than perhaps they should have fought. And a 24-year-old man from Kansas named Eddie Calloway had died in a village in Normandy that no one would ever name in any document Carl would ever see. He had done this with a pen and a printing press in a certain facility with language. He had done it without a weapon in his hands. He had done it from a folding table in a tent in North Africa, working by lamplight, satisfied with what he was accomplishing. The man who had cooked his breakfast that morning had known this for weeks, had been carrying the evidence in his pocket over his heart for weeks, and had still put the breakfast on the table at 6:30, the same as every other morning. Carl pressed his hand over his own breast pocket, where the white paper square was folded into four. He lay on the bunk and felt the flatness of the camp mattress beneath him, and outside the window, the wind was moving through the compound and carrying with it faintly the first smell of dinner beginning to cook. Otto Steiner had been at Fort Bliss since November, part of a large transport from camps in France, following the collapse of German positions along the Western Front. He was 38 years old and had been a Hauptmann in the SSA rank that by late 1944 carried mostly the weight of its own history. He had gray at his temples and the kind of jaw that suggested a man accustomed to having his expressions cost him nothing, because he had long since stopped believing his expressions were being read by anyone whose opinion mattered. In the compound, he had organized himself quickly and quietly, not through force, at least not the visible kind, through the weight of what he represented, through the gravity that attaches to men who have been in the worst of it and are still standing. Within 3 weeks of his arrival, a loose grouping of 15 or so prisoners had formed around him, former SS and Waffen officers, and a few infantry veterans who recognized in Steiner someone operating on different terms than the rest of the camp. They did not fight the guards. They were not stupid, but they operated by their own interior rules, maintaining a unit structure that the Americans had not formally disbanded, holding their own roll calls in the barracks before lights out, circulating handwritten notes that appeared for a few hours and then vanished. Carl was not part of this group. He was not aligned with anyone in the compound, which was a state of relative isolation that suited him, given that his natural inclination was toward observation rather than affiliation. But he was not far enough from Steiner to be invisible to him either, and in the second week of January, on a gray afternoon in the exercise yard, Steiner walked across the gravel and stopped beside him. He said in German that he had heard Carl was the author of the leaflet series. He said he had read the third one in France in a forward position near Nancy the week before his unit was surrounded. He said it was good work. He said it was accurate. Carl said thank you. Steiner was quiet for a moment, looking across the yard toward the wire. Then he said Carl seemed uncomfortable. He said it as an observation, not a criticism. Carl said he was fine. Steiner said he had watched Carl in the mess hall. He said Carl ate everything every meal and never complained and never made the jokes that some of the men made to perform their contempt for American food while eating it. He said he had watched Carl look at the American soldiers in a particular way. He said the way was wrong. He said, do not let their food change you. Carl did not answer. Steiner walked away. His footsteps on the gravel were even and deliberate, the walk of a man who has decided exactly how much energy each movement is worth. From that day forward, Carl was aware of being watched, not aggressively, just steadily, the way a man watches something he has not yet decided whether to use or to avoid. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning in early February, Clara Hoffman asked Carl to come to the medical unit for a routine health check. She took his temperature and blood pressure and listened to his lungs, and as she worked moving around him with the efficient economy of someone who has done this thousands of times, she said something to him in German. Carl looked up sharply. She continued working. She said her parents had come from Bavaria in 1921. She said she wanted to talk to him about Steiner. Then she told him what was in the file. She told him that Steiner's wife, whose name was Ingrid, had been 35 years old, that his sons Franz and Wilhelm had been 7 and 5, that all three of them had been in Dresden on the night of February 13, 1945, when the British and American bombers came, that the building they had been sheltering in had been struck directly, that no remains had been recovered. Steiner had received the news in March through the Red Cross, a single-type notification delivered to the camp office and passed to him by a duty officer who had no training for this kind of delivery and did it badly. Steiner had read the paper and folded it and put it in his pocket. He had not eaten for 4 days. Then he had started eating again. And from that point forward, he had become what Carl saw now in the exercise yard, a man in whom something had been permanently replaced, in whom the machinery of human feeling had been substituted with something harder and less flexible. Carl sat in the medical chair and looked at the floor. He thought about Franz, 7 years old. He thought about Wilhelm, 5. He thought about Marta at 4 asking what coffee smelled like, and something cold in particular moved through him. He asked Clara why she was telling him this. She put down the stethoscope and looked at him directly. She said he was the only person in the camp that Steiner both respected and had not yet controlled. She said she believed something was developing in the compound, something she could see the early signs of without knowing the full shape yet, and she believed Carl would need to understand this before it arrived. She did not tell him what she thought it was. She said she was not sure enough yet, but her eyes said something that her words were not ready to say, and Carl, who had spent his professional life reading the space between what was written and what was meant, understood the shape of it without needing it spelled out. He walked back to the barracks slowly. The afternoon was cold, a thin Texas cold that was nothing like Hamburg cold but was cold in its own way. The mountains to the north were clear and close, looking in the dry air. He walked with his hands in his pockets and thought about a man who had lost his children, and in losing them, had lost also the last thing that had been capable of interrupting his certainty. He thought about how a man like that became dangerous in a particular way that had nothing to do with weapons. In the same way that a man who has nothing to protect becomes capable of nothing, a man who has lost everything he was protecting becomes capable of anything. He thought about this for a long time. March came to Fort Bliss with a warming that arrived slowly from the south, the kind of warmth that does not announce itself but accumulates quietly until one day you realize you have stopped needing your coat. In Europe, the war was collapsing. Everyone in the compound knew it, the American soldiers from the newspapers that circulated through the camp, the German prisoners from the absence of good news, which was itself a kind of news. There was no celebrating on either side. The end of a thing this large does not feel like a conclusion. It feels like a silence you are not sure how to fill. Reeves had finished his report. Calloway received a copy through the administrative chain on a Tuesday evening. He read it in the kitchen after the dinner service, alone at the prep table under the single lamp he left on for the late supply inventory. The report was well written. This was what Calloway had expected and what he found most difficult about it. It cited the Geneva Convention's minimum provisions with precise article references. It calculated the current per capita caloric intake against those minimums and produced a percentage figure that was accurate and not disputable. It outlined the cost saving that a reduction to minimum standard would represent and noted correctly that this reduction would be fully compliant with American obligations under international law. There was no argument that Calloway could make against it that had legal standing. He could say that the food kept the prisoners stable and manageable. And that was true, but Reeves had anticipated this and included an appendix noting that the correlation between caloric provision and prisoner behavior was not supported by comparative data from other camps. He could say it was wrong, but wrong was not a legal category. He put the report on the table and sat with his hands around a cold mug of coffee and looked at the kitchen he had been running for 6 months. In the barracks, Otto Steiner's group was quieter than usual, which was itself a change. They had been consistent in a low level of visible activity enough to demonstrate their presence and their contempt for the camp's authority without providing grounds for official disciplinary action. The quiet was different. It was the quiet of preparation rather than the quiet of rest. Carl noticed it without being able to define it precisely. He noticed the folded papers being passed less openly, the conversation stopping more abruptly when he walked past. He noticed Otto watching him in the mess hall with a steadiness that had shifted from assessment to something more like decision. One evening near the end of March, Otto fell in beside Carl on the walk back from dinner. He said without looking at him that the war was nearly over. He said that the ending of the war did not mean the ending of who they were. He said the word German the way a man says a word he believes other men should be unable to use as casually as they do. Carl did not respond. He lay in the barracks that night and looked at the ceiling and held everything he knew in his mind at once. The way you hold pieces of a broken thing before deciding whether they are worth putting back together or whether the truth is that they were always going to break. Lena was hungry in Hamburg. Roy Calloway had sat across a table from him, close enough for Carl to see his pulse, and had chosen not to do what he had every reason to do. Otto Steiner had lost two boys whose names were Franz and Wilhelm, and had substituted his grief with the only thing he had left that still felt like forward motion. And Reeves was writing a report in precise legal language that would accomplish with paper what he could not accomplish with anything else. The morning would bring breakfast. It always did. Coffee and eggs and bread and the particular smell of the Fort Bliss kitchen working through its routine. Carl pressed his hand to his breast pocket and felt the folded white paper square still there, 4 folds palm-sized, unchanged. He did not know yet what was being planned in the barracks he could not see from where he lay. But he knew that whatever was coming would require him to make a choice he had been postponing since the first night in this country, the night he had sat at a long wooden table in a mess hall in Texas and eaten a meal that a man with every reason to resent him had cooked without resentment. You can only defer a debt for so long before it becomes a different kind of thing entirely. Outside, Bobby Garner walked the evening perimeter. The desert was cooling fast as it always did, and the stars were coming out sharp and numerous the way they only appeared in places far from city lights. He walked the wire and thought about the things he had watched in the past months. The quiet way men who had been fed every day for 6 months had begun to look different from the men who had gotten off the trucks in summer. Not just healthier, different in some other way that he could not name, but that he recognized in himself too on the buzz when everything went right into a way you had not expected it to. He thought about Calloway walking out of the barracks and saying dinner is at 6, same as always. He thought about what it cost to say that, what it required of you to say it and mean it. He walked the wire until his shift ended and went to his bunk and lay in the dark and listened to the desert, which was very quiet and very large and indifferent to all of them, and thought that he was watching something he was not going to fully understand until much later when he was old enough to have the right words for it. Something was coming to Fort Bliss. He could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. The air had a particular tension to it now, a charged stillness that the compound had not had in the summer or the fall. It had gathered slowly out of grief and paper reports and folded leaflets and letters about butter measured in grams, and it was going to resolve itself soon in a way that nobody inside the wire could yet predict. What it resolved into would depend on one man in one moment making one choice. That moment was almost here. The note was found before morning roll call on the last Tuesday of March. A guard named Peterson was doing the early perimeter check around Barracks B when he spotted it under the base of the fence post, folded twice weighted down by a small stone. He picked it up because anything left outside at night was supposed to be reported, and he carried it to the duty sergeant without opening it. The duty sergeant opened it, read. It did not understand the German, but recognized enough of it to take it immediately to the administrative building. By 7 that morning, the note was on Major Reeves's desk. It described in plain, serviceable German a plan by a group of prisoners to access the camp's electrical distribution box behind the supply warehouse on the following Thursday night. The goal, as stated, was to disable the floodlights along the northern perimeter for a period long enough to create conditions of general confusion. The handwriting was deliberate, slightly uneven, in a way that suggested someone trying to write less neatly than they normally would. The note was signed with no name. Reeves read it twice and called his administrative officer in and told him to prepare documentation for an immediate security review of all prisoner privileges, including food provision levels. He said this without emphasis, as he said most things, in the level tone of a man working through a checklist. He had been waiting for the right document. Now he had it. The news moved through the compound, the way all news moved through Fort Bliss, which was quickly and without a reliable source. By midday, most of the prisoners knew a note had been found. By early afternoon, the speculation about what it contained had produced 3 different versions, none of them entirely accurate, and all of them more alarming than the truth. Clara Hoffman heard about it from a medical orderly who had overheard a conversation in the administrative hallway. She put down the supply inventory she was working through and stood very still for a moment. Then she walked out of the medical building and across the compound to where Carl Weber was sitting in the exercise yard alone on a bench near the east fence watching the mountains. She sat down beside him and spoke in German at a volume that would not carry to the nearest guard post. She asked if he had heard about the note. He said he had heard something. She told him what she believed. She said the handwriting on the note matched a style she had seen before on a piece of paper that had fallen from the clothing of one of the men in Steiner's group 3 weeks earlier, while she was changing a dressing. She said she could not be completely certain. She said she was certain enough. She told him what she thought the purpose was. Not a real sabotage plan, a document. Something that gave Reeves the grounds he needed to classify the camp food provision as a privilege rather than a standard to begin the process of reduction he had been building toward since February. And once the reduction began and the rations went down and the men became hungry and the compound became harder to manage, the real instability would follow from that, not from any electrical box. Carl sat with this for a moment. The mountains were the same mountains. They had always been gray and indifferent, standing at the edge of the desert the way they had stood before any of this and would stand after. He looked at them and thought about a man he had never spoken to directly who had been carrying his words in his breast pocket for 8 months. He asked Clara how certain she was. She said not completely. She said enough. The space between those two answers was a small space and a very large one at the same time. Carl sat in it until the afternoon light began to shift. That night, the barracks went dark at the usual hour, 20 men breathing around him in the close air of the room. Somewhere near the door, someone was coughing in the irregular way of a man who has been coughing for weeks and has stopped noticing it himself. The cot springs of the next bunk were pressing through the thin mattress in a way Carl had memorized without meaning to the specific landscape of a surface he had slept on for months. He heard Steiner before he saw him. Not footsteps. A change in the quality of the dark, a particular awareness that comes when something that was not there is there. Steiner crouched at the side of the bunk and spoke very quietly in German, low enough that no one farther than an arm's length could have heard. He said he knew what Carl was thinking about doing. He said, "Do not." Carl said nothing. Steiner was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had lost his wife in Dresden. He said the names Ingrid, Franz, Wilhelm. He said them the way a man says the names of things that no longer exist in any form he can reach. He said that he had nothing left that functioned as a reason to continue except the refusal to let the other side win. He said that was all that remained. He said it without asking for sympathy, simply as an inventory of what was true. He said that if Carl spoke to the Americans, he would not hurt him. He said he was past the point where hurting someone would mean anything to him. But he said Carl would have to carry it. He said Carl would have to explain to Lena someday why he had chosen the men who held the wire over the men who stood behind it with him. Carl said quietly that Lena was hungry in Hamburg. The silence that followed was a particular shape. Steiner said that all of them had people who were hungry. He said that was not a reason to surrender. Then he was gone. Just the shifting dark again, and the ordinary sounds of 20 men sleeping, and the thin smell of the Texas night through the ventilation gaps at the base of the wall. Carl lay on his back and looked at the ceiling he could not see. He thought about Franz. 7 years old, and he had liked coffee with a great deal of milk on Sunday mornings, which was the kind of detail that belonged to a life and could not be retrieved once the life was gone. He thought about Wilhelm at 5. He thought about Marta at 4 years old asking her mother what coffee smelled like, and Marta growing up in a city where the answer to that question would take years to become available again. He pressed his hand over his breast pocket. The folded white paper square was still there. It had been there since the first night. It had survived months of washing and wear and had grown very soft at the fold lines, almost fabric now rather than paper. He pressed his fingers against it and thought about what it cost a man to cook breakfast every morning for someone who had contributed to the death of his brother. Not to forgive. Calloway had never claimed to forgive anything, just to cook, just to maintain the standard, just to do the thing correctly, regardless of who was receiving it. He thought about what that required of a person. He thought about what it required of the person receiving it. In the morning, Carl went to the medical unit before breakfast. Clara was already there entering the previous day's patient notes into the treatment log. He sat down in the chair across from her writing table and looked at his hands for a moment, and then said in German that he needed to speak to whoever was in charge of the camp. He said he needed her there to translate. She looked at him. She asked if he was certain. He said he was not. He said he was going to do it anyway. The meeting took place in the camp commander's office at 9 that morning. The commander, Lieutenant Colonel Marsh, was a lean man in his late 40s who had been running Fort Bliss with a quality of consistent competence that rarely required him to raise his voice. Major Reeves was present, seated to the right with the note and the supporting documentation in a folder on his knee. A staff officer sat in the corner with a notepad. Clara sat beside Carl and slightly behind him in the position of a translator rather than a participant. Carl spoke in German and Clara translated in segments, stopping when he stopped starting. When he started, her voice carrying his words into English, with a precision that altered neither the content nor the weight. He said that the note found at the base of the fence post near Barracks B had been placed there deliberately by members of Hauptmann Steiner's group. He said it was not a genuine sabotage plan. He said the purpose was to provide documentation for the escalation of security measures and the reduction of food provisions, which would generate genuine instability in the compound over time. He said this was the actual plan. He said the electrical box was not. When Clara finished translating the last sentence, the room was quiet. Marsh looked at Carl for a moment, and then looked at Reeves, and then looked back at Carl. He asked through Clara why Carl was telling them this. Carl was quiet for several seconds. He looked at his hands on the table in front of him. He looked at the window behind Marsh's desk, where the Franklin Mountains were visible in the morning light, the same mountains he'd been looking at since the day he arrived. Then he looked at the lieutenant colonel and answered. He said because no one in this compound, including the men he had just named, deserved to live through what Steiner was building toward. He said the plan, if it worked, would end in something that could not be undone. He said he did not want to be part of something that could not be undone again. He stopped. Clara translated. He started again. He said there was a man in this compound who had cooked a meal for him every day since he arrived. He said that man had a reason not to do that, which was larger than any reason Carl could point to for what he was doing right now. He said he did not know how to repay it. He said this was the only thing he had that was worth anything. Then he stopped and did not start again. Reeves stood up and left the room without speaking. His footsteps were even in the hallway, getting quieter and then gone. Marsh looked at Carl for another moment. He nodded once to Clara rather than to Carl and reached for the telephone on his desk. By afternoon, the intelligence section had been notified and 2 men had been sent from a regional office to conduct interviews. Steiner was brought to the medical building rather than the administrative building because Clara had made the request and Marsh had approved it, and the conversation that took place there was not an interrogation in any formal sense. It was 2 men from the intelligence section and a German captain who had lost his family and had nothing left to fight for except the fight itself, and Clara Hoffman sitting between them, translating not just the words but the silences, the pauses, the places where a man runs out of language and has to continue anyway. They asked him about Franz first, what the boy had been like, what he had liked. Steiner sat with his hands on his knees for a long time before answering. He talked for an hour, not about the plan, about Franz and Wilhelm, about his wife Ingrid, who had a way of saying his name when she was not angry that he had not heard from anyone else in 38 years of living, about Dresden before the war and Dresden after, and the distance between those 2 things which was not measurable in any unit he knew. He talked and Clara translated, and the intelligence men listened in a way that was not professional and not trained, just human, which was the only way available to them. He did not cry the way a man cries in a dramatic moment. He cried the way a man cries when he has been not crying for a very long time, slowly, and without theatrics, with the particular exhaustion of something that has been held too long, finally being set down. He did not become a different man in that hour. He became quieter. He became still. The quality of stillness that belongs to a person who has released the specific tension required to keep something from breaking. He did not pursue the plan after that. The compound was calmer in the days that followed, a particular kind of calm that was different from the ordinary camp routine, the way air is different after weather has passed through. Reeves's proposal to reduce the food provision was placed under administrative review. Clara had submitted her own report 2 days before Carl's meeting with Marsh, routing it directly to the medical division of the Army's Prisoner of War Administration rather than through the camp chain of command. The report was factual throughout. It compared the health data from Fort Bliss under current provision level against comparative data from camps operating at minimum Geneva standard, and it identified a statistically significant correlation between above minimum nutrition and measurable reductions in prisoner behavioral incidents, medical costs, and staff safety events. It did not use the word compassion. It did not need to. The number said what the number said. The proposal was suspended pending review in early April. The review concluded in June. The suspension became permanent. Reeves requested transfer to an administrative posting in Maryland in late February. The request was approved, and he was gone by the first week of March. Carl heard about this from Clara and said nothing, and later that evening sat in the barracks and thought about a man who had lost his son and had tried to use the instruments of procedure to make that loss mean something, and had found in the end that the instruments were not large enough for what he was trying to carry. He thought about this without judgment. He had used instruments that were too small for the things he was trying to carry as well. The months between April and December moved differently than the months before them. The war in Europe ended in May, officially and finally, and the compound absorbed this news the way water absorbs something dropped into it with a brief disturbance and then a return to surface. The men knew it was over. They had known it was coming for a long time. Knowing something officially is different from knowing it in your body, and the bodies of the men in the compound took longer to understand. They were going home. Not immediately. The repatriation process was slow and administrative and required documentation and coordination that proceeded at its own pace regardless of what anyone wanted. But they were going. The uncertainty was only about when. Carl wrote to Lena in the Kiemer and told her as much as he was permitted to tell, which was not detailed, but was enough. He told her the food was adequate. He told her the climate was dry and very different from Hamburg. He told her that Marta would find the mountains here interesting if she ever saw them, the way they looked close in the clear air, and the way that clearness could be trusted. He did not write about Callaway. He did not write about the note or the meeting or the months of sitting with a debt he could not calculate. Some things did not fit inside a letter, not because the words were unavailable, but because the person reading the letter would need to have been present to understand them. And she had not been present, and the distance between what happened and what could be communicated across that distance was just part of what the war had cost. He kept working on it in his mind anyway. December came. The Texas winter was thin and bright, the sky very blue above the ochre desert, the mornings cold in a way that surprised Carl every time, even after 2.5 years, because the cold in this country felt different from European cold, drier, without weight. The mess hall let out the smell of the kitchen every morning from 6 o'clock onward, and by the time the men arrived for breakfast, the building was warm and the coffee was ready. On December 25th, Roy Callaway had been awake since 4 in the morning. He had planned the Christmas meal in September when the first chill began to appear in the evening air. He had written to his mother in Hutchinson, and she had sent him through the ordinary mail a handwritten index card with the cornbread recipe she had used since before Roy was born. He had sourced the pork from a supplier in El Paso, not the standard camp procurement channel, a personal arrangement he had paid for with 3 months of his own saved wages. He had ordered fresh roasted coffee from a small shop on Mesa Street that roasted its own beans on Thursdays, and he had collected it himself on the 23rd, carrying it back to the kitchen in a cloth sack and storing it in the sealed tin on the top shelf. He began the pork shoulder at 4:30 low heat, apple and fresh thyme from the kitchen garden he had planted in a corner of the compound in the spring rosemary that one of the mess hall workers had brought from his own family's yard. By 6, the smell had moved through the vent system into the barracks corridors, and the corridors into the yard. By 7, it had reached the far side of the compound near the perimeter wire. Bobby Garner was on the early shift that morning, and he smelled it from the guard post at the northwest corner and stood for a moment without moving his rifle at his side, and his breath visible in the cold air, smelling slow-roasted pork and apple and coffee on a Christmas morning in the Texas desert, and thought about home in a way that was sharp and clean rather than painful, because something about the smell made home feel close rather than absent. The mess hall was set differently that morning. The electric lights had been adjusted to a warmer setting by a maintenance worker who had understood what Calloway was trying to do without being told. The long tables were clean in the way that tables are clean when someone has made an effort rather than simply fulfilled a task. At each place, there was a small package wrapped in brown paper, modest palm size, tied with a piece of kitchen twine. The men came in from the cold, 212 of them on that particular morning, German and Austrian, and a handful of Poles who had been conscripted and had ended up here through the particular indifference of large-scale events. They took their seats, and the room was quieter than usual. Not the silence of tension, but the silence of people who have recognized in the smell and the arrangement, in the particular quality of attention that the room communicated, that something is different about this morning. Carl came in and stopped just inside the door. The smell hit him, and he stood with it for a moment, not moving. Slow roasted pork and apple and thyme, in the deep round smell of properly roasted coffee, the real smell, not a substitute or an approximation. He had grown up in a house where Sunday meant the smell of something slow cooking his mother's kitchen in Hamburg, the cast iron pan on the heavy stove, the particular warmth that food generates when it is prepared with time rather than urgency. He had not been in that house in 6 years. He stood in the doorway of the Fort Bliss mess hall on Christmas morning and let the smell do what it did, and then walked to his seat and sat down. The room was full and quiet when Roy Calloway came out of the kitchen. He did not do this on ordinary evenings. He stayed in the kitchen during service, managing the line, checking the temperature on the holding trays, filling the coffee urns when they got low. Coming out into the dining room was not part of his routine, and the men noticed it immediately, a shift in attention that moved through the room from the front table's back. He stood at the end of the hall near the serving window and looked at the room for a moment. He was wearing his kitchen whites, which were clean, and he had taken off his apron. He held his hands at his sides. He looked like what he was, a cook from Kansas, standing in a room full of German prisoners of war on Christmas morning with something he needed to say and not very many words to say it with. He spoke slowly and clearly in the flat, practical English of the Great Plains. He said he was not a man who talked a great deal. He said he was a cook, and that was what he knew. But he said there was one thing he understood about food, which was that food was the way people said things to each other that did not have other words. He said he had not forgiven the war. He said he had not forgotten his brother. He said he had cooked for them every day because it was the right thing to do and because his mother had taught him that a table does not make distinctions. He said that was all he had to say. He said, "Merry Christmas." Then he went back into the kitchen. The room was completely still. Clara looked at Carl from across the table. Carl stood up. He translated into German sentence by sentence in the voice he had used for years to stand in front of a classroom and give language to things that needed language. The first sentence came out steady. The second sentence, he did not think about the sound of his own voice or whether it was right or wrong. He translated. He got to the sentence about the brother. He stopped, not because he had forgotten the words. He knew the words. He stopped because the words required him to stand in the Fort Bliss mess hall on Christmas morning and say out loud in German to 200 men who had fought in the same war he had fought in, that the man who cooked their meals had a dead brother and cooked for them anyway, and that this was a fact about the world that Carl Weber, who had spent 3 years arguing that this kind of fact was impossible now, had to transmit to other people as true. He looked at the table in front of him, the brown paper package, the white plates waiting, the steam from the serving trays at the front. He looked up. He said it. He said the sentence in German. He said the rest of the sentences. He sat down. The silence lasted 4 or 5 seconds, long enough to be a real silence, not just the pause between one thing and the next. Then the spoons began, the plates, the particular sound of a large room of people beginning to eat, which is one of the most human sounds. There is the sound of bodies receiving what they need from the hands of other people, not the sound of men existing in the same place, the sound of men eating. Bobby Garner was standing at the mess hall entrance with his rifle in his cold hands, and he watched the room and didn't move. He had been at Fort Bliss for a year and a half. He had watched a great many meals served in this building. He had watched hungry men become less hungry and frightened men become less frightened, and men who had arrived in the summer looking like they had been running on nothing for a long time gradually begin to look like men again. He had not understood until this morning what he had been watching. He stood in the doorway and looked at 200 men eating Christmas dinner on a Texas morning and understood that whatever this was, whatever had been happening in this compound through all these ordinary months of food and weather and silence and difficult conversations, it was not going to be in any history he had been taught. It was too small for history. It was the size of a table in a kitchen and a decision made every morning to do the same thing correctly and let that be enough. He stood until his hands went cold on the rifle, and then he walked back to his post and did not look back at the mess hall windows. April of the following year brought the first repatriation orders to Fort Bliss. Carl's name appeared on the third list, which was posted on a Tuesday morning in the compound bulletin board. He would leave in the second week of the month. He would travel by train to New York and by ship back to Europe, and then, by whatever arrangement could be made, to Hamburg, to the apartment on Osterbruckstrasse, to Lena and Marta, and the life that had been waiting in suspension for 3 years. He spent the days before his departure in the ordinary routine of the compound, which had become so familiar to him that its absence was already beginning to feel abstract, the way you begin to understand you will miss a place while you are still inside it. Otto Steiner was on the first repatriation list. Carl saw him in the compound on the morning before the first group departed, standing in the exercise yard in the early light with his hands in his pockets. Carl walked toward him without planning to. Steiner watched him come and did not move. They stood together for a moment in the dry April morning. The mountains to the north, the wire along the perimeter, the smell of breakfast beginning in the kitchen, building the coffee and the griddle, and the particular Fort Bliss morning smell that Carl had been breathing for almost 3 years. Steiner said in German that he still did not agree with what Carl had done. He said this without heat as a simple statement of position. Carl said he understood. Steiner was quiet for a moment. Then he said that Franz had liked coffee. He said this without looking at Carl, looking at the mountains instead. He said the boy was 7 years old and too young for it, but his wife had made a small cup for him on Sunday mornings, with a great deal of milk and a small amount of coffee, the amount you would use to color water, more than to make a real drink, and Franz would carry it very carefully in both hands and drink it at the table with a gravity that he did not apply to anything else at that age. Steiner said this in the same flat voice he used for everything, without inflection, without asking for anything. Then he looked at Carl. He said the coffee here was good. He turned and walked toward the barracks to collect his belongings for departure. Carl stood in the exercise yard and watched him go, and thought about what it cost a man to say that. What territory you had to cross inside yourself to arrive at the point where you could stand in a compound in Texas and say in as few words as possible that the enemy had given you something worth acknowledging and then walk away. He went to the kitchen building on his own departure morning, not at mealtime. In the mid-morning when the breakfast service was finished and the preparation for lunch had not yet fully started, and Calloway would be in the back doing the inventory that he did every day at this hour with the same regularity he brought to everything. Carl stood in the kitchen doorway. The cast iron range was still warm from breakfast. The smell of the morning's cooking lingered in the air, eggs and coffee, and the slight sweet smell of whatever had been in the cornbread pan. The kitchen was clean in the way it was always clean. After service, everything in its place, the surfaces wiped, the pots stacked in their order. Calloway was at the back table with the supply ledger open in front of him, writing in the steady hand he used for the inventory, the same hand he used for everything. Carl said in the careful English he had been building for 3 years that he wanted to say thank you. He said for the meals. He said for every day. Calloway did not stop writing immediately. He finished the number he was on, and then he put the pencil down and looked at the ledger for a moment. He did not turn around. He said it was not necessary. Carl stood at the doorway and looked at the back of the man who had cooked 3 meals a day for him for nearly 3 years, and thought about all the things that could not be said in English or in German or in any language. He knew the things that existed only in the gap between what a person does and what they could have done instead. He said, "Your brother, Eddie. I am sorry." The kitchen was very quiet. Calloway stood still at his table. 10 seconds passed. The range made the small metallic sound it made as it cooled. Outside the compound was beginning the ordinary sounds of a mid-morning. Calloway said, "I know." He picked up the pencil and went back to the inventory. Carl turned and walked out of the kitchen into the April morning. The air was warm already, the dry Texas warmth of a desert spring, and the mountains were clear and close, looking in the early light. He crossed the compound toward the barracks to collect the few things he would take with him: the photograph of Lena and Marta, the letters that had come through the Red Cross, the folded white paper square that had been in his breast pocket since the first night. He thought walking across the Fort Bliss yard for one of the last times about what he was going to do with what he had learned here. Not the facts. The facts were the facts, the infrastructure, and the ration books, and the cornbread recipe, and the supply ledgers, and the things that happened, and the things that could have happened and did not. He meant the thing underneath the facts, the understanding that had been arriving slowly since the first meal, and that he still did not have a complete sentence for only pieces of one, only the partial grammar of something he would spend the rest of his life trying to finish saying. He reached the barracks. He took his pack from the corner of his bunk and put the photograph and the letters inside. He held the white paper square for a moment. Then he put it in the pack as well, carefully, the way you carry something that has become important through use rather than intention. Stuttgart, West Germany, summer of 1988. A man named Michael Weber was cleaning out his father's apartment on a Saturday morning in June. Carl Weber had died the previous Tuesday, a stroke at the age of 74, in the small apartment he had lived in for 30 years, in the city he had come to after Hamburg, because Hamburg after the war was a city that required a great deal of forgetting, and he had decided he did not want to spend his life forgetting things. He had taught literature at a secondary school in Stuttgart for 26 years. He had been a careful and attentive teacher, the kind students remember, not because they were inspiring in a theatrical way, but because they were honest, because they told you what was true about the book in front of you and let the truth do its own work. Lena had died in 1978. Carl had lived alone in the apartment for 10 years after that, quietly with his books and his regular habits, the same small routines repeated until they became the shape of a life. Michael was 31 years old and working through his father's belongings with the methodical patience his father had modeled for him. The apartment was not large, and it was not cluttered. His father had not accumulated things. The books were organized. The kitchen was clean. In the bottom drawer of the writing desk, under a folder of school administrative documents from the 1960s, he found an envelope. It was unsealed. The paper was old, slightly yellowed, the kind of pale cream paper that was manufactured in the 1940s. The address on the front was written in his father's handwriting, careful and clear, the handwriting of a man who had spent his professional life believing that clarity was a courtesy. Sergeant Roy Calloway, Fort Bliss Army Base, El Paso, Texas, United States of America. There was no stamp. There had never been a stamp. Michael sat down on the floor of his father's study with the envelope in his hands and took out the 4 pages inside. The letter was dated April of 1946. It was written in German throughout, except for certain sentences that had been attempted in English, and then abandoned the English written below the German in the smaller, more careful hand of someone working in a language they had not fully claimed yet. The crossings out and the restarted phrases showed a man who had tried to bridge 2 languages and found the bridge incomplete, and written the German anyway, leaving the English attempts as evidence of the effort. The letter began by saying that the writer did not know how to start and was going to try. It went on for 4 pages. It described in the orderly way of a man trained to organize ideas what had happened to Carl Weber in the 2.5 years at Fort Bliss, not the events. The understanding, the slow revision of a set of beliefs that had felt like facts and had turned out to be a particular kind of story, the kind that holds together only because you do not look at it too directly. The meals. What the meals had meant. The morning in the barracks when a man with every reason for a different response had put the leaflet back in his pocket and said dinner was at 6, same as always. He wrote about Eddie. He wrote about it at length, the specific weight of it, the debt that does not have a currency. He wrote, "You proved to me that it is possible to feed a person you have reason to hate and do it correctly, and let that be what you do not as forgiveness, not as the absence of memory, but as a decision made every morning, regardless. I did not know that was possible before I sat at your table. I have been trying to understand what it required of you ever since." He wrote near the end of the letter, "I wrote a pamphlet that said, Americans fight from habit and Germans fight from belief. I was wrong about every part of that. What I watched you do at Fort Bliss was not habit. It was the hardest kind of belief there is. The kind you maintain not because it is easy, but because you have decided it is the only thing worth maintaining." The last page said only I could not find the right words in English to send this. By the time I had the English, I was afraid you would not want to receive it. I am sorry for the waiting. I am sorry for everything that came before the waiting. I am leaving this in a drawer because I cannot decide whether to send it, and maybe the decision will come later when I know more than I know now. Maybe it will come to someone else to decide. Michael Weber sat on the floor of his father's study for a long time after he finished reading. The June light came through the window at the angle of a Stuttgart afternoon, the same quiet city light his father had lived with for 30 years. He folded the letter back along its original creases, which had softened over the decades into near fabric. He sat with the envelope in his hands and thought about his father, who had been a secondary school teacher, and a careful man who had organized his books and kept his kitchen clean and told his students the truth about the literature in front of them, and had never in Michael's memory talked about the war. He thought about what it meant to spend 40 years deciding whether to send a letter and leave the decision finally to someone else. He stood up. He put on his jacket. He took the envelope to the post office on the corner and stood at the counter and explained to the clerk that he needed to find an address in the United States, a military base in Texas, a man who would be in his late 70s now, and he would appreciate whatever help was available. It took 4 months. The Fort Bliss Records Office, when contacted, had no current address on file, but a veterans organization in Kansas maintained contact information for former service members from that state who had enrolled voluntarily, and Roy Calloway of Hutchinson, Kansas, had enrolled in 1962 at the request of an Army historian compiling records of camp administration during the prisoner of war period. The letter arrived at a small house on the edge of Hutchinson in December of 1988, 42 years after it was written. Roy Calloway was 77 years old and retired. He had come back to the farm outside Hutchinson after the war and cooked at the diner on the main road for 12 years until the diner was sold, and then at the elementary school cafeteria for another 15, and had retired at 65, and now lived in the house his mother had left him, and tended a kitchen garden and cooked for himself with the same precision he had always cooked because the standard did not change depending on the audience. He was in the kitchen when the letter arrived. He heard the mail slot and came out and picked it up from the floor and carried it to the table and looked at the handwriting on the envelope, which he did not recognize, and the German postmark and the return address in Stuttgart. He sat down and read it in the morning light at the kitchen table slowly, with the dictionary his mother had kept on the shelf since his father came back from the First War, moving through the German with the same patient effort he had brought to the leaflet 42 years before. It took him a long time. When he finished, he set the letter on the table and sat with his hands around the coffee mug, which had been hot when he sat down and was now cool. He looked out the kitchen window at the Kansas December, the flat, colorless fields and the pale sky, and the quality of light that belongs to the plains in winter, which is a truthful kind of light, clear and without decoration. He sat there for a while. The kitchen was warm around him. Outside, the fields were bare and the sky was very wide. Then he got up and went back to the stove and made another pot of coffee and started on breakfast, moving through the familiar motions with the ease of a man who has been doing this for 50 years. The cast iron pan warm in his hand, the eggs in the bowl, the bread in the oven, already beginning to smell the way bread smells when you give it the time it needs. Bobby Garner wrote a book in 1994. It was not a long book, 112 pages, published by a small press in Des Moines that specialized in what it called personal accounts of mid-century American life. He had been an elementary school principal in Ames, Iowa for 23 years before retirement, and the book was something he had been writing in small pieces for 3 decades, added to on weekends and long evenings, pages accumulating. The way things accumulate when you are not in a hurry, but you know you are moving towards something. The last chapter was about Fort Bliss. He wrote that he had not understood what he witnessed there until he was old enough to have the language for it. He wrote that he had watched a great many things in that compound through 18 months of guard shifts and perimeter walks and mess hall duties, and that the thing he remembered most clearly, the image that had not faded in 50 years, was a man in kitchen white standing at the end of a dining hall full of German prisoners of war on a Christmas morning, saying he had not forgotten his brother and he had cooked for them anyway. He wrote, "I have thought about that sentence for half a century. I have taught children for 23 years, and I have tried, when the situation gave me an opening, to explain what that sentence meant without explaining it directly, because the things that matter most tend to be smaller and more specific than any general statement can reach." What I understood watching Roy Calloway that morning was something I could not have been told. The strongest kind of person is not the one who never had a reason to stop. It is the one who had every reason to stop and made the same choice every morning anyway, and let that be the whole of it. He wrote, "I have been trying to live up to what I saw in that mess hall my whole life. I am still working on it." The mountains stood where they had always stood above the empty desert. The wire was long gone, and the compound with it replaced by something else entirely, as compounds and wars tend to be replaced, while the land underneath them continues unchanged and patient. The Franklin Mountains rose gray and clear in the dry air, visible for miles, looking closer than they were in the particular way of things in places without moisture to obscure the distance. The coffee in Hutchinson was hot in the morning. In the old cast iron pot on the old range in the old farmhouse kitchen, where a man of 77 had been cooking breakfast every morning for 50 years, for no audience but himself, and whatever the morning required, doing it correctly, because the standard did not change depending on who was there to see it. That was all. That was the whole of it. A table does not make distinctions. What you bring to it, you bring.